13. Biggest scumbags in Black church history. What happens when the very people trusted to guide souls become the ones who destroy faith? Behind the stained glass and Sunday sermons, some pastors built empires of lies, greed, and scandal that shattered entire communities. From secret affairs and stolen millions to deadly cult rituals, these stories reveal the darkest side of the Black church. You won't believe how far some so-called men of God went to protect their power. Stay with us as we expose the 13 biggest scumbags in Black church history. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence. T.B. Joshua. Temitope Balogun. Joshua, better known as Prophet T.B. Joshua was one of the most famous and polarizing religious leaders in Africa. Born in Nigeria in 1963, he founded the Synagogue Church of All Nations Scone in Lagos, which grew into a massive megachurch, attracting millions of followers worldwide. At his peak, he claimed to have more than 15,000 people attending services every week, with visitors flying in from across Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Known as a healer and miracle worker, Joshua presented himself as a prophet who could cure illnesses like HIV cancer and even paralysis through prayer alone. His ministry generated enormous wealth, and his televised broadcasts reached tens of millions, making him a spiritual superstar. But his legacy was marred by tragedy and controversy. On September 12, 2014, a guest house at Scone collapsed, killing 116 people, including 81 South Africans who had traveled to Nigeria seeking healing. Investigations revealed that the building had been constructed with substandard materials and illegally expanded without permits. A coroner's inquest ruled that criminal negligence was to blame. Instead of accepting responsibility, Joshua suggested the collapse was caused by sabotage or supernatural forces, even claiming a mysterious aircraft flew overhead before the building fell. For grieving families, this denial deepened the pain, and for critics, it proved that his ministry valued expansion and spectacle over safety. This was not the only deadly incident tied to Joshua. In 2013, at his Ghana branch, 4 people died in a stampede during the distribution of holy water he claimed could heal any sickness. Critics accused him of exploiting desperation using showmanship and staged miracles to control followers. Medical experts warned that his claims encouraged people to abandon real treatment in favor of risky faith healing. Joshua also faced backlash for his teachings on sexuality. In 2021, YouTube banned his channel, which had over 1.8 million subscribers, after videos surfaced of him conducting violent deliverances on gay people, claiming to cast out homosexual demons. The footage showed disturbing scenes of physical abuse, masquerading as exorcism, sparking global outrage. Despite scandals, millions continued to see Joshua as a true prophet. When he died suddenly on June 5, 2021, just days after preaching a sermon, tens of thousands gathered in Lagos to mourn him. For loyalists, he was a persecuted man of God, whose works spoke louder than critics. For skeptics, his ministry symbolized the dangers of unchecked charisma, false hope and negligence disguised as faith. T.B. Joshua's story remains one of paradox, a man revered as a miracle worker by multitudes, yet condemned as a manipulator by others. His influence was undeniable, his following immense, but his legacy will forever carry the shadow of lives lost and promises unfulfilled. Eddie Long. Bishop Eddie Long was once the face of Black megachurch culture, a man who built his empire on the message of morality, family values, and traditional faith. At the height of his power, his New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia, drew more than 25,000 members, making it one of the largest congregations in the United States. Long was charismatic, sharply dressed, and had a commanding presence that made people believe he was a man chosen by God. He spoke out forcefully against homosexuality, abortion, and cultural sins, presenting himself as the defender of biblical truth in a modern world. But behind the sermons and the carefully crafted public image, A scandal was brewing that would forever tarnish his legacy. In 2010, 4 young men, former members of his congregation, came forward with shocking allegations. They claimed Long had used his role as a spiritual father to groom them for sexual relationships when they were just 17 and 18. According to lawsuits filed in Georgia courts, Long showered the teens with cars, jewelry, luxury trips, and cash while cultivating an intimate and manipulative relationship. To outsiders, it looked like generous mentorship. To the accusers, it was grooming masked as spiritual guidance. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the Christian world. Members of New Birth could hardly believe that the man they called Bishop was accused of violating the very moral code he preached every Sunday. The scandal dominated headlines, cable news debates, and social media, igniting national conversations about hypocrisy in the church. Long himself denied everything, publicly calling the accusations false and insisting he was being attacked because of his faith. Yet in 2011, rather than face trial, he quietly reached a confidential settlement with the 4 accusers. The details were never made public, but the lawsuits were dropped, and the church's reputation was permanently damaged. No guilty verdict was ever declared, but neither was his innocence proven. The fallout was devastating. Attendance at New Birth began to decline rapidly. A ministry that once thrived with tens of thousands saw pews empty as disillusioned members left. Long's once ironclad moral authority disintegrated, and his name became synonymous with hypocrisy. For many, he symbolized the dangers of unchecked pastoral power. The scandal didn't just hurt him personally, it fractured an entire faith community. By the mid-2010s, Long's health visibly deteriorated. Rumors swirled as he lost dramatic amounts of weight, and in 2017 he passed away at just 63 years old. In the end, Bishop Eddie Long left behind 2 legacies, one of growth, innovation, and community outreach that made him a giant in modern Black church history, and another of secrecy, scandal, and betrayal that erased much of the trust he had built. His story is not just about one man. It's a cautionary tale of how power, when unchecked, can corrode even the most respected spiritual leaders. Henry J. Lyons. Reverend Henry J. Lyons rose to the pinnacle of Black religious leadership when he became president of the National Baptist Convention USA, Inc., an organization that claimed more than 8.5 million members across thousands of congregations. To millions, Lyons was supposed to embody moral authority, a steady hand guiding the nation's largest Black denomination. But what he built in public as a shepherd of souls, he secretly destroyed in private with greed, deceit, and corruption. His downfall began in the mid-1990s when reports surfaced that Lyons had been diverting church funds into his own pockets. The schemes were elaborate but brazen. He sold fraudulent membership lists to corporations pocketing the profits. He leveraged his position to gain access to donor money that was supposed to rebuild churches across the South destroyed by arson during racial attacks. Instead of ensuring those congregations rose again, Lyons funneled the money into real estate, jewelry, and lavish lifestyles. While small-town churches sat in ashes, he purchased mansions and drove luxury cars. The scandal might have remained hidden longer, if not for a moment of domestic rage that exposed everything. In 1997, Lyons's wife, Deborah, discovered that he had secretly purchased a house with another woman. Consumed with anger, she set fire to the home, a blaze that became national news. The spectacle led investigators to dig deeper into Lyons's finances, and what they found was staggering. Auditors uncovered that over $4 million in church funds had disappeared under his watch. The man who was trusted to steward charitable donations had instead treated the convention like his personal bank account. Do you think a leader's betrayal hurts more when it involves money that was meant to help the most vulnerable? By 1999, the evidence against Lyons was undeniable. He was indicted on charges of fraud, extortion, and tax evasion. During the trial, prosecutors painted him as a manipulator who lived a double life, holy in the pulpit, but corrupt in his dealings. The judge did not mince words describing Lyons's behavior as a betrayal of the highest order. That same year, Lyons was sentenced to 5.5 years in federal prison, Brands. Even after serving his sentence, Lyons's name never escaped the shadow of the scandal. Attempts to return to ministry were met with suspicion and outrage. For many, his actions reinforced the stereotype of prosperity preachers enriching themselves at the expense of their flocks. For others, it was a reminder of how unchecked power within religious institutions can lead to systemic corruption. Lyons passed away in 2019, leaving behind a deeply tarnished legacy. In the end, his story serves as a cautionary tale when leaders misuse faith to satisfy greed. The damage doesn't just devastate bank accounts, it shatters trust in the very institution meant to uplift the community. Carlton Pearson. Bishop Carlton Pearson's story is one of the most dramatic rises and falls in modern Black church history. Not because of sex or money, but because of theology. In the 1990s, Pearson stood at the height of success. His Higher Dimensions Evangelistic Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma, drew crowds of nearly 5,000 every week, and his annual Azusa conferences filled stadiums with tens of thousands. He appeared on television, traveled the globe, and was hailed as one of the brightest stars of Pentecostalism. People admired his charisma, his commanding voice, and his ability to connect with both Black and white audiences in ways few pastors could. To many, he was destined to become the next great global evangelist. Then came a revelation that would change everything. Pearson claimed that while praying, God spoke to him and revealed that there was no eternal hell, that all people, regardless of faith or belief, were already saved through Christ. He called this radical message the gospel of inclusion. To traditional Christians, it was outright heresy. For centuries, the doctrine of heaven and hell had been the foundation of Christian teaching. By denying hell, Pearson was seen as denying accountability, repentance, and the very need for the church itself. The backlash was swift and merciless. By 2004, the Joint College of African American Pentecostal Bishops convened a tribunal and officially declared him a heretic, a word that hadn't been seriously applied in church circles for generations. Almost overnight, his congregation shrank from thousands to just a few hundred. Members who once cheered his sermons fled, taking their donations and loyalty with them. Pearson, who once filled auditoriums, suddenly found himself preaching to nearly empty pews. Refusing to recant, Pearson eventually aligned himself with the United Church of Christ, a more liberal denomination that embraced his inclusive theology. Later, he found a home with the Unitarian Universalist Church, moving even further from evangelical Christianity. To his critics, this was proof he had abandoned the faith. To his supporters, he was a visionary who dared to challenge tradition in pursuit of compassion. The consequences were devastating. His once thriving ministry never recovered financially or socially. Friends in the evangelical world abandoned him. Former allies, including Oral Roberts, his spiritual father, cut ties. By the end of his life, Pearson was no longer a household name in Christianity, but rather a cautionary tale whispered in sermons about what happens when preachers go astray. Yet some argue that Pearson's downfall was less about corruption and more about courage. He did not steal, cheat, or abuse. He simply preached an idea that terrified the religious establishment. Whether one sees him as a heretic or a prophet depends entirely on perspective. Carlton Pearson passed away in November 2023 at age 70, leaving behind a complicated legacy, once a megachurch superstar, later a pariah, and to some, a man who tried to make grace truly universal. Jeremiah Wright. Reverend Jeremiah Wright spent decades building a reputation as a fiery, unapologetic voice in the Black church. For over 30 years, he pastored Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, transforming it from a modest congregation into a thriving community of nearly 8,000 members. His preaching was unapologetically rooted in Black liberation theology, a tradition that connects Christian faith with the struggle for racial justice. Wright baptized Barack Obama, officiated his wedding to Michelle, and became a spiritual father figure to the man who would one day become president. But what began as a pastoral relationship ended up shaping one of the most explosive political controversies in modern American history. In 2008, as Obama's campaign for the White House gained momentum, clips of Wright's past sermons surfaced in the media. In one of the most replayed moments from a 2003 sermon, Wright thundered, "No, no, no, goddamn America." He was condemning America's history of slavery, systemic racism, and military aggression. While his church members understood the context, mainstream America saw an angry preacher cursing the nation. The timing could not have been worse. Obama was running on unity and hope, and suddenly, his longtime pastor became a national lightning rod. Cable networks looped the clip endlessly. Talk radio erupted with outrage. Political commentators debated whether Obama could win the presidency with such a radical spiritual mentor tied to him. It wasn't just about Wright's words. It was about what they symbolized: anger, division, and a raw critique of America's sins. To save his campaign, Obama delivered one of the most important speeches of his career, "A More Perfect Union." In it, he acknowledged Wright's anger as rooted in legitimate racial pain, but rejected his divisive rhetoric. The speech calmed the storm for some, but it didn't end the controversy. Ultimately, Obama was forced to publicly cut ties with Wright, ending a 20-year relationship. To Wright, it felt like betrayal. To Obama, it was political necessity. The scandal had long-lasting effects. Wright retired in 2008, but his legacy was forever tied not to his decades of service, but to a soundbite played millions of times on television. His defenders argue that he was unfairly caricatured. His broader ministry focused on community uplift, education, and justice, not hatred. His critics insist his words revealed the danger of mixing anger with the pulpit. What cannot be denied is that Jeremiah Wright changed the course of American politics. Without him, Barack Obama might not have had the chance to prove his ability to confront America's racial wounds so directly. And without Obama's speech distancing himself, Wright might have sunk the campaign before it truly began. Today, his name still sparks debate: prophet or provocateur, mentor or menace. Father Divine. Father Divine, born George Baker in the late 19th century, became one of the most extraordinary and controversial figures in Black church history. Unlike pastors who merely claimed prophetic gifts, Father Divine insisted he was God himself walking on earth. During the Great Depression, when millions were desperate for food and hope, his message of divine power and material blessing drew thousands of devoted followers. For them, he wasn't just a preacher, he was the living Almighty. His movement, called the Peace Mission, organized communal homes known as heavens. Followers surrendered their possessions, wages, and property in exchange for shelter, meals, and the promise of eternal salvation. These heavens operated almost like religious colonies where strict rules governed everyday life. Members refrained from alcohol, tobacco, and even sexual intimacy while dedicating their labor and money to Father Divine. Meanwhile, he lived in opulence, owning sprawling estates, luxury cars, and prosperous businesses, all under the claim that God deserved the very best. His reputation reached national headlines in 1932 when he was arrested for disturbing the peace after neighbors complained about loud services. A judge sentenced him to 1 year in prison and denounced him as a fraud. Just 4 days later, the judge died suddenly of a heart attack. When asked about the death, Father Divine reportedly said with a sly smile, "I hated to do it." To critics, it was chilling arrogance, but to followers, it was undeniable proof of his divine power. Attendance at his gatherings surged, and newspapers fueled the aura of a man whose enemies fell by mysterious means. In the years that followed, Father Divine expanded his influence into real estate, hotels, and restaurants, amassing an empire worth millions. Yet contradictions surrounded him. He preached purity and modesty while draping himself in wealth. His most controversial act came in 1946 when he married a young white follower, Sweet Angel, and declared that his deceased first wife's spirit had entered her body. To many outsiders, it confirmed suspicions that his ministry blurred the line between faith and manipulation. By the mid-20th century, his peace mission had spread across the country, but membership declined as new religious movements emerged. Still at its peak, his following numbered in the tens of thousands, and his influence reached far beyond Harlem, where his movement first thrived. Father Divine passed away in 1965, leaving behind a diminished but still active peace mission that struggled without his magnetic presence. His life remains a symbol of both faith and deception, an extraordinary reminder of how deeply people will believe when they are desperate for miracles, and how easily charisma can be mistaken for divinity. Sweet Daddy Grace. Sweet Daddy Grace, born Marcelino Manuel da Graça in 1881 in Cape Verde, rose from humble beginnings as an immigrant laborer to one of the most flamboyant and controversial leaders in Black church history. Arriving in New Bedford, Massachusetts, he worked as a cranberry picker and factory laborer before proclaiming himself a man of God. By the 1920s, he had founded the United House of Prayer for All People, a movement that grew rapidly among poor and working-class African Americans, who found hope in his dramatic style and promises of divine blessing. Grace was instantly recognizable. He wore flashy, custom-tailored suits covered in diamonds and jewels, and his fingernails were so long, reportedly up to 6 inches, that he couldn't feed himself without assistance. Followers carried cash in processions, waving bills in the air as they marched down church aisles to place offerings before him. Services resembled grand theatrical performances, blending gospel music, dancing, and ecstatic worship with displays of wealth and pageantry. For his supporters, this spectacle was proof of God's power working through their leader. For critics, it was manipulation and exploitation at its worst. Grace turned religious devotion into a highly profitable empire. He allegedly sold blessed soap toothpaste and even coffee, claiming these everyday items carried spiritual power. The most notorious rumor was that he sold actual plots of land in heaven, promising guaranteed entry into paradise for those who gave generously. He insisted that his immense wealth was evidence of divine favor, declaring that if God wanted him poor, he would have made him poor. Since he was rich, Grace argued it meant God had chosen to bless him. Would you consider his wealth a true sign of divine blessing, or a scheme to exploit vulnerable believers? His personal life was equally scandalous. Grace faced multiple paternity suits from women who claimed he fathered their children. In 1951, he narrowly escaped conviction under the Federal Mann Act, which made it illegal to transport women across state lines for immoral purposes. Though acquitted on a technicality, the trial reinforced his reputation as a preacher who blurred the line between faith and indulgence. Despite controversy, money poured in. By the 1950s, Grace owned lavish mansions in several states, fleets of the most expensive cars, and hosted extravagant parties. To his critics, he was a con artist exploiting poor congregants. To his devotees, he was a living vessel of God whose prosperity meant their own salvation was secure. When Sweet Daddy Grace died in 1960, he left behind a sprawling fortune and an empire of businesses and real estate. His church survived his passing, though never as powerful as during his lifetime. Sweet Daddy Grace's story endures as one of the most glaring examples of how faith, spectacle, and charisma can build an empire, but also how extravagance can blur the line between religious devotion and personal gain. He remains a controversial figure, revered as a prophet by some, reviled as a fraud by others. James Francis Jones. Prophet James Francis Jones, better known simply as Prophet Jones, was one of the most flamboyant and controversial preachers of mid-20th century America. Born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1907, he rose to fame in Detroit during the 1940s and 1950s, a period when being openly gay could destroy reputations, careers, and even lives. Yet Jones did not hide who he was. He wore silk suits, diamond rings, and drove luxury Cadillacs through the streets of Detroit, strutting with a confidence that challenged both social norms and religious expectations. His ministry was unlike anything America had seen. Prophet Jones filled auditoriums with followers, hosted radio programs that reached thousands, and turned his services into dazzling spectacles. Congregants described his sermons as electrifying performances filled with dramatic gestures, music, and a sense of theatrical flair. At the height of his popularity, he was considered one of the most influential black preachers in Detroit, attracting both admiration and suspicion. But beneath the glamour was a constant tension. His open flamboyance and rumors about his personal life made him a target for law enforcement and critics alike. In 1956, Detroit police launched a sting operation against him. They sent an undercover vice officer to pose as someone interested in Jones, hoping to catch him in an act that could be prosecuted under Michigan's strict morality laws. According to police reports, Jones allegedly groped the officer during a private encounter. Later that night, officers raided his home and claimed to have found him with two young men, turning the allegations into a national scandal. The case exploded in the press. Headlines branded him a morals offender, and the image of a preacher caught in homosexual acts scandalized mid-century America. Yet Jones fought back vigorously in court. His lawyers argued he had been entrapped, lured into a situation by police who were determined to ruin him. After a lengthy trial, a jury acquitted him of all charges. Legally, he walked free. But freedom in court did not restore his reputation. The damage was already done. Radio stations canceled his programs. Churches distanced themselves, and many of his followers abandoned him. What had once been whispers about his private life were now shouted across front pages nationwide. His influence, once so commanding, evaporated almost overnight. Prophet Jones continued to preach, but never again with the same power or reach. He lived the rest of his life in relative obscurity, remembered more for scandal than sermons. He died in 1971, leaving behind a complicated legacy, a man who defied norms with courage, yet also became a symbol of downfall in the eyes of the public. To some, Prophet Jones was a pioneer who dared to live authentically in a hostile era. To others, he embodied the dangers of mixing flamboyance, faith, and controversy. His story remains one of the most unusual chapters in Black church history, a tale of charisma, spectacle, and the crushing weight of public judgment. Creflo Dollar. Creflo Augustus Dollar Jr., better known as Pastor Creflo Dollar, became one of the most recognizable and controversial faces of the prosperity gospel movement. Born in College Park, Georgia in 1962, he built his ministry on a simple but powerful message: God wants you to be wealthy. His World Changers Church International, founded in 1986, with just 8 members, grew into a global empire with tens of thousands of followers, multiple campuses, and an international television presence. Dollar's sermons emphasized faith, financial giving, and prosperity, and his personal lifestyle became a living example of the message he preached. He drove Rolls-Royces, lived in multi-million-dollar mansions, and traveled the world in private jets. For supporters, his wealth was proof that faith works. For critics, it was evidence of exploitation. The breaking point came in 2015 when Dollar publicly asked 200,000 followers to donate $300 each so he could purchase a brand new $65 million Gulfstream G650 jet, one of the most luxurious private aircraft in the world. His justification was that commercial airlines were too restrictive for ministry work, and only the world's most advanced private jet could allow him to spread the gospel efficiently. The backlash was immediate. Social media erupted with outrage. Comedians mocked him, and even some of his own supporters questioned whether a preacher truly needed such extravagance. Under pressure, the fundraising campaign was quietly removed, but the damage to his reputation was lasting. This was not the only controversy in Dollar's career. In 2012, he was arrested on charges of assaulting his 15-year-old daughter during an argument. Though the charges were later dropped after he completed anger management classes, the arrest raised questions about his character and family life. Over the years, critics have accused him of twisting scripture to manipulate donations, pointing to his multi-million-dollar estate and luxury lifestyle as evidence. Yet Dollar's influence remained undeniable. His church continued to draw tens of thousands, and his teachings reached millions around the globe through television and media. In 2022, he shocked many when he publicly admitted that some of his previous teachings on tithing were wrong, telling his congregation to throw away every book, tape, and video he had ever made on the subject. For a prosperity preacher, this was almost unheard of, a tacit admission that he had built decades of sermons on a flawed foundation. For his critics, the admission was too little too late. For his loyalists, it was a sign of humility and growth. Either way, Creflo Dollar's name will always spark debate. To some, he represents faith rewarded with prosperity. To others, he embodies the worst excesses of televangelism. His story reveals how charisma and wealth can draw massive crowds, but also how easily they can destroy trust when spiritual leadership begins to look more like a business empire than a ministry. Kirby John Caldwell. Reverend Kirby John H. Caldwell was once celebrated as a model of pastoral success. Born in 1953 in Houston, Texas, he rose from modest beginnings to become senior pastor of Windsor Village United Methodist Church, one of the largest Methodist congregations in the United States. Under his leadership, Windsor Village grew from a small flock into a megachurch with over 14,000 members, praised for its community development programs, schools, and social initiatives. Caldwell wasn't just a pastor, he was a national figure serving as a spiritual advisor to President George W. Bush. He delivered the benediction at Bush's 2001 presidential inauguration and later prayed at the 2004 Republican National Convention. His voice carried weight in both religious and political circles, making his eventual downfall all the more shocking. Between 2013 and 2014, Caldwell engaged in a fraudulent investment scheme that targeted some of the most vulnerable people, elderly members of his own congregation. Alongside his business partner, Gregory Allen Smith, a financial planner from Louisiana, Caldwell convinced investors to purchase historical Chinese bonds supposedly worth millions. He claimed these bonds, dating back to the early 20th century, would bring enormous returns once they were cashed in. In reality, the bonds were worthless pieces of paper with no financial value. Despite this, Caldwell persuaded church members, retirees, and small investors to hand over life savings, ultimately collecting around $3.5 million. The betrayal ran deep. Many of those defrauded were seniors who had devoted decades of service and donations to Caldwell's ministry. They trusted him not only with their spiritual lives, but with their financial futures. For years, Caldwell had preached about honesty, responsibility, and service. To see him orchestrating such a cruel con shattered that image for countless followers. By 2018, federal authorities had built a strong case. In 2020, Caldwell was indicted on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he pled guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Prosecutors emphasized the deliberate nature of the crime. This was not a mistake, but a calculated scheme to steal from those who trusted him most. In 2021, Caldwell was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison and ordered to pay back more than $3.5 million in restitution. For a man once prayed over by presidents, the image of him in an orange jumpsuit marked a dramatic fall from grace. His career, once filled with prestige and political connections, was over. The story of Kirby John Caldwell is a devastating reminder of how power and trust can be abused within the church. His rise and fall echo a painful truth: when spiritual leaders cross into financial exploitation, the damage extends far beyond bank accounts. It erodes faith itself and leaves entire communities questioning who they can truly trust. Juanita Bynum. Juanita Bynum rose to fame in the 1990s and early 2000s as one of the most powerful female voices in American televangelism. Born in 1959 in Chicago, she overcame humble beginnings and personal struggles to become a best-selling author, gospel singer, and preacher whose fiery sermons resonated with millions of women. She called herself a prophetess, and her teachings about prayer, holiness, and self-worth struck a chord in the Black church community. At her peak, her conferences filled stadiums, her books sold in the hundreds of thousands, and she was hailed as a spiritual role model. But behind the glamorous image of prosperity and divine favor, her personal life became the center of one of the most infamous scandals in modern church history. In 2002, Juanita married Bishop Thomas Weeks III in a lavish ceremony broadcast on television. Their wedding was presented as the perfect union of two prosperity gospel stars, an inspirational love story meant to show the world how God rewards faithful servants. The couple co-authored books about relationships and ministry, and they were celebrated as royalty in the evangelical world. But by 2007, their marriage had crumbled. The fairy tale came crashing down in August of that year when the public witnessed its darkest moment. In the parking lot of an Atlanta hotel, Weeks brutally assaulted Bynum. According to police reports, he choked her, pushed her to the ground, and stomped on her until a stranger intervened to stop the attack. The incident made national headlines. For many, it was shocking to see a woman who preached about faith and strength become a survivor of domestic violence in such a brutal public way. Weeks was arrested and charged with aggravated assault and making terrorist threats. The couple divorced shortly afterward. Bynum, rather than retreat in shame, declared domestic violence has a face, and it is mine. She reinvented her ministry to advocate for women who had suffered abuse, using her platform to give a voice to survivors around the world. Yet controversy continued to follow her. In the years after the assault, Bynum launched expensive ministry products, including a $1,500 prayer kit containing anointing oilcloths and other items she claimed would empower believers' prayer life. Many accused her of commercializing faith, turning tragedy into profit. Others defended her, arguing that every preacher sustains ministry through donations and products. Despite the criticism, Bynum never fully disappeared from the religious landscape. She continued preaching, writing, and recording music, with her story serving as both inspiration and caution. For some, she remains a trailblazer, a woman who survived domestic violence and used her scars to empower others. For others, her legacy is clouded by the blending of genuine ministry with financial excess. Juanita Bynum's story captures the paradox of modern televangelism, a woman who once embodied divine victory, who fell into scandal and pain, yet who found a way to rebuild herself on the same stage where she had been broken. Kevin O. Smith. Prophet Kevin O. Smith, leader of the Pathways International Kingdom Restoration Ministries in Montego Bay, Jamaica, presented himself as a divine messenger with the power to unlock heaven's gates. To his congregation, he wasn't just a pastor, he was a prophet who claimed to hear directly from God. His followers believed he could perform miracles, cast out demons, and guarantee their salvation. But beneath the surface of religious devotion was a chilling descent into cult-like extremism that ended in bloodshed. On the night of October 17, 2021, Smith orchestrated what he called a special deliverance ritual. Congregants gathered in anticipation of a breakthrough blessing. Instead, they witnessed horror. According to survivors, Smith convinced members that the only way to secure a direct path to heaven was through sacrifice by death. In the chaos that followed, 2 members were stabbed to death in what authorities later described as ritual killings. Others were injured as panic spread through the church. Terrified worshipers who escaped ran to alert police, setting off a raid that exposed one of the darkest episodes in Jamaica's religious history. Police arrived to find a scene of carnage. Officers reported blood on the floor, dazed survivors, and signs of planned ritual violence. Smith was arrested immediately and charged with murder, terrorism-related offenses, and conspiracy. The case shocked Jamaica and the wider Caribbean, raising painful questions about how a charismatic leader could drive ordinary people to participate in such acts. The story grew even stranger days later. While being transported to court for his first hearing, the police vehicle carrying Smith overturned in a crash. Both Smith and a police officer died instantly. To many observers, it was a tragic but fitting end to a man accused of orchestrating religious killings. Yet to his loyal followers, the crash was no accident. They saw it as divine intervention, proof that their prophet had been taken up by God rather than judged by earthly courts. The fallout devastated the community. Families mourned not only the victims of the ritual, but also loved ones who had been drawn into Smith's ministry and deceived by his promises of salvation. Religious leaders across Jamaica condemned him, warning of the dangers of charismatic figures who exploit desperation and faith for control. Sociologists compared Smith's group to cults, noting parallels with other movements where absolute loyalty to a leader led to violence. Smith's story is a stark reminder of how blind devotion can be weaponized. His rise and fall show the thin line between faith and fanaticism, how one man's charisma can inspire both worship and destruction. In death, he left behind not a thriving ministry, but a legacy of fear, betrayal, and tragedy that scarred an entire nation. Paul Lewis. Reverend Dr. Paul Lewis was once hailed as a rising star in Caribbean evangelism. Born in Jamaica but based in New York, he built an international ministry in the early 2000s that drew massive crowds to his fiery crusades. Known for dramatic altar calls, booming sermons, and claims of supernatural healing, Lewis positioned himself as a man of God with the power to change lives. He preached across the Caribbean, Africa, and the United States, attracting tens of thousands who longed for deliverance from poverty, illness, and despair. At his peak, his name carried weight as a charismatic evangelist who seemed destined for global influence. But in 2009, his carefully crafted image collapsed. During a crusade in Westmoreland, Jamaica, Lewis met two teenage girls who attended his services. According to police reports, he invited the 15-year-old and her 14-year-old friend back to his hotel. What followed became a criminal case that rocked his ministry to its core. The 15-year-old accused Lewis of sexual abuse, leading to his arrest on charges of carnal abuse and indecent assault. In Jamaica, those charges carried the possibility of decades in prison, and the news spread rapidly through both local and international press. The allegations divided his supporters. Many abandoned him immediately, unwilling to be associated with such a scandal. Others defended him fiercely, arguing that he was a victim of lies and that Satan was using false accusations to destroy his ministry. Churches that once welcomed him suddenly closed their doors and international invitations dried up. His once thriving crusades dwindled as the case dragged on in court for nearly 2 years. In 2011, after a lengthy trial conducted behind closed doors to protect the minor witness, a jury acquitted Paul Lewis of all charges. His defense lawyers argued successfully that the accusations were fabricated, pointing to inconsistencies in testimonies and claiming he had been entrapped. Legally, Lewis walked free. But freedom in court did not mean freedom from suspicion. For many, the trial confirmed their doubts. Even without a conviction, his reputation was permanently damaged. Following his acquittal, Lewis tried to rebuild his ministry, but the damage was irreversible. Attendance at his events never recovered to earlier levels, and his international reputation faded. What had once been a story of a young preacher with boundless potential turned into a cautionary tale of how quickly credibility can be destroyed by scandal, even when a jury says otherwise. Reverend Dr. Paul Lewis's rise and fall underscores the fragile nature of trust in spiritual leadership. In communities where faith is the foundation of life, accusations against a pastor do more than harm one man's career. They fracture entire congregations and cast doubt on the very message they once embraced. His story remains a sobering reminder that once faith is shaken, even acquittal cannot fully restore what has been lost. Power, faith, and charisma can inspire entire generations, but history shows us how easily they can also corrupt. From stolen millions to deadly rituals, these scandals left scars not only on the individuals involved, but on entire communities who trusted them. Some argue these leaders were visionaries who lost their way, while others see them as outright frauds who never deserved the pulpit. What do you think? Were they misguided men and women or deliberate deceivers who preyed on hope? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence.